So this video that you're watching this morning, I recorded yesterday. We're going back in time. I mentioned it at the end of my review that I wanted to do that, and I just thought I'll just hit the record button and I'll carry on and give a broader overview of Potter, having sort of reviewed the game yesterday. The reason I wanted to do that is I didn't want to read any of the comments or listen to anybody else's review or anything like that, because I didn't really want it to influence what I thought about the game. However, I wasn't that disciplined, truth be known. I couldn't quite help myself. I was curious. I wanted to hear what Graham Potter had to say after the game. And I was going to say I'm glad I did, but I'm not so sure. I could have gone quite a long time without hearing what Graham Potter had to say. It's not so much the words, it was his demeanour and it was the way he carried himself, because I tell you, it wasn't good at all. So as you know, sort of after games, they do that interview that's sort of just down the tunnel with they're stood up and there's a guy interviewing them. So I watched that one first, which is on the official West Ham website. And then later on, I guess it's like an hour later, 45 minutes later, they'll sit down in front of the press. And that's when everybody's asking the questions rather than just one interviewer. And I've been quite critical over the years of people not asking football managers tough questions or sort of pertinent or relevant questions. That wasn't the case here. Someone came straight in with Potter and asked him about the fact that they were singing about, well, really singing about Nicholas Füllkrug, and basically Nicholas Füllkrug, he says what he wants. He's a big German and he says what he wants, is the polite version of that, which by association means that Graham Potter doesn't say what he wants, which I think has been part of the problem. Anyway, Graham Potter did not come across well in this interview, not at all. And I'm actually a little bit worried about him, actually, because he appeared to be very upset. But not just very upset, very down, very browbeaten. If you watch the start of it, just when he goes down, he sits down in his chair and he does this. And you've got to remember, there's a room full of people looking at him. He did not look in a good way. And listen, he is under a lot of pressure, but also he's not. If that makes, well, it's completely contradictory. Considering he's just moved to a club, he's under pressure, but there's no threat of relegation or anything like that. He is quite safe in his job. So it's not like it was that final game to save his job. There are managers under far more pressure than him. There are managers that have got the sack this season. And I think it was quite a worry to see him respond in the way that he did. I've spoken many times on this channel, if you're a long-time sufferer and you've been watching a long time, about managers who they get to the end and they just look like they've got to the end of the road, right? And Ange Postecoglou, I've mentioned him recently. He started off as, the cheeky, chappy, Aussie bloke that everyone likes, calling everyone mate, happy-go-lucky. He's turned from that into, as I said the other day, he's like a guy with a persecution complex. He thinks the whole world's out to get him. But it's taken a long time to transition into that. I thought Southgate had it at the end of his stint. I remember Dalglish getting it. I remember Dalglish going back to Liverpool for a second time. And he just did not want to be there. Hodgson at England's another one. I remember Nigel Pearson. Bilic towards the end had that. Moyes had it. There's, funny enough, somebody left a message on yesterday's video. And you know what it's like. There's a lot of people who like to give West Ham fans a kicking for Moyes leaving. I mean externally. And somebody popped on yesterday and said, well, you're basically happy with the football you got now. Moyes was qualifying you for Europe every season and blah, blah, blah. And I probably bit and I probably shouldn't have, and I probably shouldn't. I just said, well, hold on a second. This is not the case. As I've said before, the David Moyes that Everton have got is not the same David Moyes that we had at the end. By the end, David Moyes was completely browbeaten at West Ham. He was finished. He looked ill. He looked drawn. He'd lost his right-hand man in Alan Irvine. You could draw a line under West Ham's results from when Irvine left. It's almost like looking at two different managers. Moyes pre-Irvine, then after Irvine, right? So it was his tactician. It was his trusted guy. It was his right-hand man. Irvine left. Stuart Pearce left. Paul Nevin left. And he left, and there weren't great stories going around at the time, and he left as well. And then Mark Warburton left and said he had to leave West Ham because he had to leave if he was to maintain his friendship with David Moyes, because they'd had a falling out over football. Basically, David Moyes lost 4 of his coaching staff in less than 12 months. He was left. He was like a shell of a man. He wasn't the same manager that we'd had during COVID, right? But normally it takes quite a long time for these managers to get browbeaten, for them to get so sort of downbeat and melancholy. That's what Potter looked. He looked like that in this game. He looked like he'd had enough, and I think that's a bit of a worry. There's a couple of things that I was a little bit concerned about, actually. So we've been saying quite a lot recently, sick of hearing the positives, sick of hearing him talking about it. There's no doubt in my mind that has been, I don't mean like this video, but I just mean generally people have been saying that, West Ham fans. I've no doubt in my mind that that's been filtered back to him, because he was saying in his interview, people don't want to hear the positives. I said, I don't want to speak about the positives. I've had enough. And he was saying things, and I think it's one thing for us to say we don't want to hear about the positives, but he has to remain positive. He has to retain a belief in himself. That's really important. I would expect any manager to do that. Anyone that's got a lead, that's got to galvanise a group of people, you've got to have confidence in your own ability, or at least portray that you have. I think that's going to be really tough. I'm not sure that's a great thing for his players to see him like that. He was talking about West Ham's mentality, and don't get me wrong, there's definitely something wrong with the mentality of players at West Ham. There really is. But the way he was responding, it was like he'd had enough. He was saying, it's hard for me. I can swear if you want. It was unedifying. It was a tough thing to watch, really. And there are a few people who were basically looking at it and saying he's lost it. He's lost it. And whilst I wouldn't go that far, I wouldn't overly argue with him either, because I can see why somebody could say that. And I tell you what, halfway through January, February, March, April, I mean, 3.5 months, just over 3 months he's been here, and he looks like he's had enough already. And it goes back to sort of what I was saying Saturday morning's video, I think it was. Is West Ham a bigger club than he thought it was? Is the scrutiny too much? Is it? I find it hard to believe that it could be, but I do wonder. He couldn't even. I mean, he really did have the hump. He had the proper arsehole, I tell you. They asked him at one point about. I don't even think that the journalists. I think even the journalists were feeling sorry for him at the end. I think they were thinking, "Oh, crikey, this is a bit depressing. Let's try and give him a lift." Well, tell us about those positives, Graham. No, he didn't want to. And he said, "Well, they said, well, you're still in the game until the end, and it was sort of like a world-class 35-yard world-class goal that won the game for Brighton." And apparently Hersler had gone into the I haven't watched. I'm not that much of a sucker. Apparently Hersler had gone into the Brighton press conference before and said that they were always going to try and work hard in the last 10 minutes and target West Ham, because you would, wouldn't you? And they relayed that. The journalists relayed to Potter and said to him, Brighton were working hard in the last 10 minutes, that part of the game plan. How would you be able to counter that? How are you going to look to rectify that going forward, sort of thing? And he turned around, he said, well, I can't speak about Brighton. He said, that's what happens if you win. You're a genius, aren't you? Everyone's got a plan. Again, it was quite snappy, I don't know, quite narky, none of it reflected particularly well, I've got to say. More importantly, none of what he was saying gave you the impression or any confidence at all that next week he'll get it turned round. None of it gave you any confidence or any impression that the next week on the training pitch is going to be really good. Do you know what he said as well? They said, what are you going to do? He said, we're going to have to stick together. Now, look, I've been highly critical of Graham Potter. Don't get me wrong, I really have. And there were a couple of minor positives. Unfortunately, it's just too late. What you can't do, you can't have a plucky performance where you might have been a bit unlucky and you lose. You can have one of those, but as long as they're sandwiched in between some good stuff, you can't do that when it's sandwiched in between a load of crap performances where you haven't got results. So but the way he was talking, we've all just got to stick together now. It was like it was the end of the world, and I don't want to. I just think that's a tough one, because actually for him, he was actually in a really good position this season. There really was no pressure on him. He sort of brought it on himself. He could have gone to the end of the season. So I think by the end of the season, he'd have had 19 games, 19 or 20 games. He could have won 6 of them, drawn a bunch, and it probably would have been all right for next season. But it's not the end of the world. I mean, it is far from it. Although we played no part in it. Yesterday was the day, or as you're watching this, yesterday was the day when we became mathematically safe. That's nothing to celebrate, don't get me wrong. That's nothing to think brilliant about. But it's not the end of the world. Now you really can mathematically start planning for next season. But it was almost a case of, well, we're just going to have to stick together and try and get through it. And I don't want to hear that, mate, really. I doubt the players want to hear it either. And I've looked at him and I thought, I wasn't even sure I was looking at a man that could lift himself. I mean, his spirits. So if you're not going to be able to lift your own spirits, how are you going to be able to cajole and motivate a whole group of people? I think if I was chairman of West Ham, I would have been worried about the results. I'd have been worried about the football. I'd have been worried about the way we're losing games. But I've got to be honest with you. If I was the owner of that club, the final thing that had made me really, really concerned would have been watching that press conference.